Welcome back, AP. All right. Fantastic class today. I know some of y'all were really digging the stories, especially, how Mary Queen of Scots lost her noggin and all that stuff, talking about Lady Jane Grey and how much we hate Bloody Mary, or who's just, might as well be like Scabby Mary, because she didn't really kill that many people in the long run. But she still was a terrible person because she led a crying, poor, pitiful little girl, the 9 Days Queen, Lady Jane Grey, to her death, right? We talked about the Act of Supremacy under Henry VIII. Definitely go back, highlight that bad boy, just so you know that declared him the supreme head of the church, right? And also declared the English country as now being Protestant, with a little part of it that you don't need to know, was referred to as the Oath of Allegiance, right? So, big thing going forward, though. Then we talked about the rule of Mary. We talked about how it was very short rules, only about 5 years. She got married to this guy named Philip. Philip was really, really into being king of England while he was watching his Spanish country just go down the tubes. Big thing you should write down there, back over next to Philip. You could just jot down, be like, hey, Spanish economy in the toilet, right? So, or anything like that. So then we talked about Elizabeth, right? We talked about how Elizabeth came back and then brought England back to being Protestant, right? Brought them back to being Anglican, and how her two biggest issues are going to be Puritans and the Catholics, right? And she meets them in the middle by trying to be like, okay, no more monasteries, no more Latin masses for the Puritans, et cetera, change up the transubstantiation views, and then for the Catholics as well, she was like, okay, you're allowed to practice, but you got to do it at your house. You cannot be doing it in public because we are now a Protestant country, which is separate from the Roman Catholic Church, right? So Mary, Queen of Scots, she has her executed because she believes that her former brother-in-law, Philip II, was telling her to throw a coup and overthrow her entire kingdom, right? So this is going to be a major thing, all right? Philip II saw a huge ally in the Scots, right? Due to the fact that the Scotland area at the time was Catholic, right? And so the Scottish leaders were all Catholic, and the Scottish populace were actually Catholic at the time, until this guy shows up that we'll talk about here in a few minutes, named John Knox. But really quick, let's double check that. When did John Knox go back to Scotland? Scotland. He arrived in Scotland in 1555. Okay, so good to know. All right, yeah, and it's going to take his faith like a little while to grow. But anyway, so getting back into it though, Philip II, Elizabeth believed, was trying to lead a coup against Elizabeth through Mary, Queen of Scots, right? Mary, Queen of Scots is then executed by Elizabeth to prove a point, and then also to further infuriate Philip, she supports the Dutch, right? So the big thing about the Dutch, all right, the Dutch were trying to liberate themselves from Philip's control, okay? The Dutch were establishing the East India Company. They converted heavily to Protestantism. They were about to enter their Dutch Golden Age. They were trying to liberate themselves from the Holy Roman Empire and from Philip's rule in totality. They didn't want to be under Habsburg rule anymore, right? So the English are going to support the Dutch revolt. They're going to support the Dutch actually liberating themselves from the Spanish Empire and overthrowing Philip, right? So they're going to give them weapons and money and ships and all this other stuff. And so Philip decides he's had enough of this, right? He's had enough of this thing that he's lost the throne of England because the woman that was gross that he married died, right? He's furious that Elizabeth is now supporting the Dutch, right? Also at one point, Philip tried to marry Elizabeth, and she said no. All right, so Philip literally was like, hey, I married your sister. How about you let me marry you so he could actually stay in power in England? And Elizabeth was like, no, I am not doing that. All right, so what ends up breaking out in 1588 is known as the Spanish Armada. All right, so the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada is a major pivotal point in the progression of AP European history, right? And in 1588, the Spanish Armada breaks out, right? And what happens at the Spanish Armada is Philip decides to send 130 Spanish ships, right? He is going to take these humongous Spanish galleon ships and throw as many of them as he can right at the English shores, right? He decides he wants to directly invade England, right? His plan is to show up in the English Channel, and I'll show you right here on this little map, right? So let me move myself down here, and then we're going to pull up this map of Europe, right? So Spain's plan was to show up from northern Spain, come up, and take this humongous fleet of 130 ships and land in the English Channel right here, dock off, get on land, and actually invade England directly, right? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is several crazy things, okay? What ends up going down, though, and I'll go ahead and show you on this screen so we can move a little bit faster, is that Philip was not expecting the fact that the English were prepared. They were prepared to have this fight, right? Now, they didn't have nearly as many ships when you actually look at it right here. They had many, many fewer ships than the Spanish did. These are the Spanish forces right here, and these are the English forces on this side. The English were heavily outnumbered, but their ships were lighter, they were faster, and they were heavily armed, right? About only half of all the Spanish boats are going to make it back, right? Because Philip II took a massive gamble, right? Took a massive gamble, and he ends up losing this fight to the Queen of England, right? The Protestant Queen of England, right? This massive, massive gamble kind of backfired in his face due to several different reasons. One of them has to do with these things called fire ships, which we'll talk about here in a second. Storms off the backside of Ireland, and also the fact that they didn't expect the journey to last as long as it did, so a lot of their food went bad, and some of their sailors almost starved, right? So what ends up occurring in the Spanish Armada is they end up showing up right here, and they end up getting into a major engagement with the English right off the shores of the mainland of England, right? Now, the crazy part about it is England hired some people very specific, right? She, Elizabeth I, hired some of her former male interests, right? These pirates, right? Now, she didn't refer to them as pirates, though. She called them privateers, right? Which is why the University of New Orleans mascot is the privateers, right? It's basically saying, like, pirates that we have employed, right? So now the privateers under the leadership of Sir Francis Drake decide that they're going to use some very, albeit questionable, but very intense methods to drive the English back, or not the English back, to drive the Spanish back, right? And they use a couple different methods. One, they lure them into enclosed spaces where the English ships can come up behind them and outflank them because they're much faster and quicker than the Spanish ones. They also use these things called fire ships. They took old English boats and set them on fire and literally launched these boats at the Spanish, right? They literally had these old English ships and they threw them at them, sails fully up, and then they would light the ships on fire. And so it's like this humongous flaming ship coming right at the Spanish, right? And so the Spanish end up losing a heavy amount of boats in the first engagement, right? Philip then decides, or not Philip himself, but Philip's admirals then decide, you know what we'll do? We'll go this way, right? We'll go this way and we'll limp along, right? We'll limp along. We'll go all the way around the backside of England and then we'll dock off in Ireland, right? Why is this a smart move? That's exactly right, Morgan Hutchinson. Because the Irish are Catholic, right? Spain is Catholic. The plan is to recruit a new land army in Ireland and then storm into England via this direction and actually take over. But what happens is they run into a huge amount of storms off the backside of Ireland and the backside of England, right? And in this process, they lose more ships to storms than they did lose to the English vessels during the Spanish Armada. By the way, this occurred in 1588, all right? So 1588, oh my God, 1588, right? So in 1588, he ends up losing more vessels to storms and spoiled food than he ends up losing to the English. Because the plan was get off in England, right? Convert the Welsh, try to get their supplies, resupply with more food here, storm into London this direction, right? Then that didn't work. Fire ships and pirates, right? Francis Drake ends up coming here. They decide to go this way. They end up losing a lot of boats due to like storms and stuff. Then they were going to go to Ireland and they were going to get more, but then the English met them off and the Spanish Armada had to just limp back home. And Philip lost this major engagement, right? A Protestant now country led by a woman just told you to shut the front door on your way out. All right, so because this is a very big deal. She has now stood up for herself in a very huge political move and has destroyed the Spanish fleet, right? Like this is a massive thing. So with that kind of comes to end the entire like Philip II, Catholic, going after England, etc., etc. And where we will leave off in England is talking about the Spanish Armada and Elizabeth's victory and her reforms to the church, right? And then in the next unit, we're going to get into her family that takes over after her, the Stuarts, right? Due to the fact that she doesn't have any kids, so like they can't actually inherit the throne, right? But all the while going on in Switzerland, now we got to move away a little bit, right? So now we're getting into the rise of Calvinism. Notice I have France up there. You need to put France/Switzerland, right? France/Switzerland, okay? So this guy is going to decide to be the next big dog Protestant reformer, okay? So just to give you a heads up, let's give a date for this. Let's give a date just so you can kind of understand where we are in the big narrative, right? So Calvin flees to Switzerland. Switzerland. All right, so, and there we go. Yep. Calvin fled to Basel, Switzerland, where in 1536 he published his first edition of Institutes of Christian Religion. Okay, so this is all the way back in 1536, right? So we just talked about England and we went all the way forward, right? And now we just jumped all the way back. And we're now again in the time where Henry has just separated the Church of England away from the Roman Catholic Church, right? So I know that's confusing, but you just got to know that while Henry was doing his thing in England, this guy, John Calvin, was over in France doing some very sketchy things, all right? So, because John Calvin is going to live from 1509 to 1564, right? And in 1533, which is, of course, so as you know, he was born in 1509. Luther becomes active in 1517. So when Luther begins his narratives forward and actually has the Diet of Worms and the Schmalkaldic Wars break out and all this other stuff, he's way in the past, right? He existed long before Henry ever even did his, Henry was alive and was ruler of England when Luther was the ruler of England. But just so you know, Luther starts in 1517, right? Henry separates the Church of England in the 1530s, right? He's the defender of the faith at first, but whatever. So John Calvin then really gets his feet wet in the 1530s as well, okay? And now Luther is already active when he was born, okay? So Luther is already creating his Solo Fide, Solo Fide, Solo Scriptura, and Solo Grazie, or whatever it's called. Grazie's thank you in Italian. I'm pretty sure that's not how you say grace in Latin. But he's creating all of his new moves and ideas, right? So, big thing is, he wasn't really moving. He was kind of ran out of France, right? So, France, heavily Catholic during this time period. Heavily Catholic, and never really stops being Catholic. We will get into this in class, and we will talk about how they almost stopped being Catholic, and the nobles wanted to stop being Catholic, but the nobles wanted to stop being Catholic for the same reason that the German princes wanted to stop being Catholic, for power, right? But just so you know, John Calvin was originally from France, right? And in his younger years, there was this big event, and I can never remember what it's called, but it's like the war, it's like a propaganda war, right? It's like the war of these advertisements or whatever. Okay, for some reason I can't find out what the name of this thing is, but I'm going to link in the description in the bottom John Green's Crash Course European History videos that are all about this entire movement. They talk about Calvin being banished out to Switzerland and stuff like that. But anyway, so after all these posters start popping up all over France, and all over Paris mainly, that are talking about the priest in the mass and be a Protestant and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He has kind of ran out of France, right? And so he moves from France to Switzerland. And the specific city that he moves to in Switzerland in 1536 is Geneva, right? And he does this to create the ultimate Christian community. We talked about this today and how this becomes a pivotal place for Protestants to run off to if they're fleeing their country and learn about being a Protestant, right? And he calls this place the Genevan Consistory, all right? So, the consistory is the group that runs the place, right? But in Geneva, he creates a purely Protestant community, right? The ultimate Christian utopia. And while he's there, he outlines all his beliefs in this thing called the Institutes of Christian Religion, right? Which is actually going to be published again in the 1530s, right? And so in this, he outlines the ideas of Calvinism, right? And according to Calvin, who breaks even further from Martin Luther and goes even in a further direction of intensity, he takes a lot of different views on this stuff, right? He does go in line with the transubstantiation beliefs of Luther, right? Believing that it's kind of like, it's not necessarily like the flesh, it's like kind of a symbolic thing, right? He goes in line with Luther and the ideas of being able to read vernacular text, right? He goes in line with the Luther of being the grace of God, not a church, okay? However, he continues continues to push the narrative further forward. Kind of a lot like Zwingli's followers, right? Kind of like the Anabaptists. Except the thing about it is Calvinism is going to be more accepted in other countries than Anabaptism is. Anabaptism almost came a little too early. Had Anabaptism came later, it might have been able to get a foothold inside of some of these other communities. But it never actually kind of really got off the ground. Calvinism, on the other hand, becomes not only a new Protestant faith, but then becomes like an umbrella term to refer to several other types of Protestants, right? So like Huguenots and Puritans. So the big thing that they believe in Calvinist communities, though, is they believe in God's absolute omnipotence, right? Now, this is very important, okay? They believe in the concept that God knows everything. He knows the past, he knows the future, he knows everything you're going to do before you even do it, right? And also in his text, he emphasizes coupling with this absolute omnipotence is the weakness of humanity and the temptation to turn to sin, right? The idea that you are every day encountering things like gambling and drinking and singing in public and wearing clothes that aren't black and white and focusing on anything that's not your work ethic is like sinful or disgusting, right? Thinking about not going to mass, right? The weaknesses of humanity. And so he extrapolates this whole concept, basically saying that you're so weak and disgusting that God already knows if you're going to heaven or if you're going to hell before you're even born. So this goes in line with the idea of what he coined as predestination, right? Which I also argue a lot of times, is this pessimistic or is this kind of positive, right? Like, what are we really getting at? Are we trying to say that John Calvin believed, that, you're destined to be saved, so you'll be fine? Or is he being interpreted later on as being a pessimist, saying that most of you will be going to hell? I don't really know, all right? I can't really argue that, but the concept of predestination is very, very important to Calvinism. Basically saying that you are destined to go to heaven or hell, and God knows where you're going before you've even lived your life and or died, or before you're even born, right? So, big things about it, though, is in these Calvinist communities, you think it would be absolute anarchy, being like, oh, well, he knows I'm doing it anyway. Well, the idea is that in Calvinist communities, those are the pre-elected. Those are the saved. They are the ones destined for heaven. So they outlawed in Calvinist communities all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And you can see this in the book you're reading right now in Mr. Cotton and Miss Caldwell's class right now in the Scarlet Letter, right? Drinking is not allowed in Puritan communities. Dressing in vain clothing is not allowed in Puritan communities. Stepping outside of your societal role is not allowed in Puritan communities. Committing adultery, committing anything, public drunkenness, singing too loudly. Why have I said singing so many times? Like skipping church. If you skip church, you get a ticket. You're fined if you don't go to church. You could be on your deathbed and you're like, I can't make it this Sunday. You're going to get a ticket like it's a parking ticket, right? Like, so there are all kinds of other things that are outlawed in Calvinist communities. And what I would like you to do for a little bit of like possible extra credit, if you can find some other stuff that was outlawed in Calvinist communities, let me know, all right? So bring it into class and we'll talk about it a little bit, all right? So what this is going to happen, though, is they're going to create this thing known as the Genevan consistory, right? As in being consistent, right? Consistory. So the Genevan consistory becomes this group of Calvinist leaders taught by Calvin himself, even after he is dead, that enforce the laws that are outlined in the Institutes of Christian Religion that was written by John Calvin himself. So the Genevan consistory puts people on trial for violating Calvinist law, and you could even be put to death. But a Genevan consistory would be the idea of the people who incriminated Hester Prynne, right? The ones that told her she had to wear the A as a symbol of her public shame and disgustingness, right? So, like, that's a really big important thing. This Genevan consistory becomes this concept of, like, oh, these group of people that enforce all these wild laws in Calvinist communities. These laws that relate back to the absolute omnipotence of God, the weaknesses of humanity, and also this concept of predestination, right? So, with this, though, and I also have something right here, says the refugees. Let's extrapolate on that really quick. What a refugee is somebody who's fleeing from their homeland from fear of persecution, right? So what becomes a huge place in Geneva is him, again, giving safe haven to runaway Protestants, right? And that was where the Puritans came from. So really quick, on the refugees, say underneath there, be like, The Puritans, right? The Puritans are a group of these refugees because when these Anglicans showed up in Geneva trying to find safe haven, Calvin and his community was like, oh, well, you're just diet Catholic, right? You know that. You're just kind of a weak version of being Catholics. So you should definitely try to kind of separate yourself from that completely, and your church should cleanse itself of all of its Catholic ideas, right? And that's why they were called Puritans, because they were supposed to be purifying the Anglican Church, right? And the refugees would then eventually go back to England when Elizabeth comes to power. They were ran out by Mary. They learned from Calvin to become Puritan, and that's why you have Puritans in Massachusetts that are now accusing Hester Prynne of adulterous activity, but not really chasing down the man that is responsible for it, which is ridiculous. And all this other stuff. And I'm probably misquoting this book. I haven't read it since high school, but, let me know. Now, I'm sure you will. But the big thing about it, though, is these refugees become these Puritans, and that's a huge developmental state for us because, these people are also some of our original colonists in the United States of America, right? So the Puritan community never would have existed had Mary not come to power, chased them off, and they went to Calvin to learn new things about Protestantism and then go back to their communities and then discuss these new ideas, right? Because Puritans also believed in some simpler concepts of predestination. They believed in God's absolute omnipotence, and the other big key thing is they believed that religious law should be the guiding light of all laws that exist in a community. That's why John Winthrop in the Puritan communities of Massachusetts led them with texts of biblical texts, right? These Genevan consistories kind of existed a little bit everywhere, right? And then also really quick, I think I have a sticky note right here. Do I have a sticky note on the screen right now? I do. Wow, yeah. Apparently, I'm not supposed to forget about John Knox. All right, so John Knox is another very famous reformer, right? And he's a Scottish reformer. And he goes to Geneva to learn from Calvin, and he adopts a thing called Presbyterianism, all right? Jot that down. So John Knox creates the Presbyterian Church, right? And he eventually goes back to Scotland in the 1530s and then begins to preach the concepts of not the 1530s, I think it's the 1550s. Preach the concepts of Presbyterianism, which are much more closely related to Calvinism than they are to Catholicism, all right? And so Scotland even begins to turn towards another faith, right? So really, really quick, I want to do a really, really fast thing and just kind of for 2 seconds talk about the concepts and the growth and the intensity that is going to become the Protestant Reformation throughout all of Europe, right? So what we're going to do real quick is we're going to kind of identify on this map all these different groups of Protestants that are popping up all over the place, right? So right here, you've got, in England, you've got the Anglicans, and you've also got the Puritans, right, who are going to be the Anglicans and the Puritans are going to be post-Calvin, right? Right down here in Switzerland, you've got Calvinism that's going to be blowing up. And keep in mind, it's right next to France, right? So some of that Calvinist ideas is going to leak into them as well, right? And then over here, we have, of course, in the Holy Roman Empire, we got a bunch of people going Lutheran, right? So we have a lot of these people popping up. And then John Knox ran away from Switzerland, and not ran away, but moved back to Scotland and takes them to Presbyterianism. And I'm going to call it P-R-E. Oh my God, this is atrocious. Pres. All right, they're going Presbyterian, right? And some of the only areas that remain devoutly Catholic include places like, and I'm just going to use a cross for Catholic, right? Boom, Italy. Boom, Spain. And then we're going to talk about these guys a little bit, but also most of France stays super Catholic, right? But look at all this, right? Religious unity in the Reformation is now absolutely destroyed, right? There are now, we can count them really quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 major faiths that are, right? Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 major faiths that are running around Europe. And we're not even counting the Anabaptists. We're not even counting the Quakers who are starting to pop up as well as a product of the Anabaptist movement. We're not talking about any of those guys. So religious unity is now gone in Europe, and plurality is now reigning, as in having multiple churches. Plural, like plurality. Do not get that concept of religious plurality confused with pluralism, which is that thing that the priests were doing where they were holding multiple offices and collecting multiple salaries and really kind of making a lot of people mad. All right, so but that's from early on, right? So really, really quick, that's the big thing about it, though, that you need to make sure you know. And is the Catholic faith going to respond to these churches popping up all over the place? Of course they are. And we're going to get to that here in about 2 seconds. Now, if you're looking at this map really quick, though, as you can also see, the Reformation is going to even hit Eastern Europe, right? But Eastern Europe becomes almost like a melting pot of all of the different groups, okay? Because all three major trends, Catholic, Lutheran, and Calvinist, could be seen popping up throughout Eastern Europe. Because look at this right here. We got the Calvinist Presbyterians right up here from John Knox. We got Calvinism right here. We got Calvinism leaking into France. We got Calvinism going into the Dutch as well, which is very important that you know also. I forgot to say them. The Dutch even go Calvinist, which is why they're trying to liberate themselves from Philip II and his Catholic rule, right? And then you've also got the Lutherans who are popping up heavy right here. And then you've got this whole thing. And also even some of the old Hussites from Jan Hus are farting around over here in what is now the the former Bohemia, which is now Czech Republic, right? You've got little teeny tiny little Anabaptist cells, and then over here you also have Islamic and Eastern Orthodox faiths, right? So Eastern Europe became almost like this big melting pot of all the different major faiths that have been popping up, right? Now, are the Catholic Church officials going to respond to all this stuff? Of course they are. They have to, right? They absolutely have to respond to all this stuff. And so they lead what is known as the Counter Reformation, right? Let's double check on our time, where we're going and where we're getting to, right? And then, all right, nice. We can definitely cover this stuff like later on. But still, let's go ahead and go over this real fast, okay? So the Catholic Reformation is going to pop up, and this is going to be called the Counter Reformation, right? The Catholic Church realizes under some subsequent popes who come up during the Protestant Reformation that we've got a real problem. We have a problem because our faith is running people away, right? We have an issue because we've got Luther in Holy Roman Empire, who's now long dead, but still, he's causing us issues, right? We've got Henry in England. We got Calvin in Switzerland. And they're really destroying not only their money that's coming in, but also the solidarity of the Catholic faith, right? Then arrives Pope Paul III, right? Pope Paul III shows up, and he is going to encourage the Counter-Reformation. He encourages the Catholic faith to look internally, to look at themselves, and really kind of step back and be like, wow, we are the ones causing this. We are the ones creating this because of all the things that we've kind of done negative this entire time, right? And he is going to separate himself from these Renaissance popes that came before him because he encourages reform. He discouraged the buildings of new churches, discouraged this idea of putting $1 million fresco on the ceiling of every single one of them, discouraged the idea of continually adding things to the Vatican City to just make them look more grandiose, right? So he supports the reforms of education to make sure that priests are being formally trained. He also supports stricter clerical life. No more pluralism, no more priests getting into the priesthood or noble families putting their kids in the priesthood because they know it's going to be an easy job where they're going to make a lot of money, right? He said that no, clerical life should be again about those Benedictine rules of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the church. He believes in purging and cleansing the Catholic faith and giving you the Catholic faith that exists now, the post-Reformation Catholic faith, right? And he establishes the holy office of the Roman Catholic Agency to combat doctrinal heresy, right? Which is a really, really big thing that I don't like about it. All right, so anyway, now this is the one thing I don't like about Paul, all right? Pope Paul III did establish this concept of the Roman Catholic Agency to combat doctrinal heresy, where he basically creates a list of books that are banned for all Catholic people to read, right? The Praise of Folly by Erasmus ends up on it. Utopia by Sir Thomas More ends up on it. Pica Mirandola's 900 Theses ends up on it. Several other Calvinists writer of the Institutes of Christian Religion ends up on there. Writings of Luther end up on this list of banned books. I don't like that about Paul because he's not allowing them to read and decide on their own because he's still encouraging masses in Latin. He's still encouraging Bibles only being written in Latin. He's not encouraging the list of vernacular things. But I do like how he is trying to fix things. Not every religious figure or every single historical figure is going to be perfect, right? Paul III did a lot of good stuff. Education reform, reform of the church, stop building up all these nice things. We are not here to make money, but then he's also like, but I don't want you reading stuff. I don't like that, right? But he is still a very all-important figure, right? And he also kind of kept the Inquisition around. So the Inquisition, of course, being the church court to try people who are heretics and possibly see them burned at the stake, right? Now, however, he did speak out against a lot of the death sentences and things like that. And he was saying that we need to kind of like tamp that down a little bit. And he also encouraged the Catholic Church to be the leaders of the Inquisition instead of like the Spanish Inquisition that happened over in Spain, where they were like, "Are you sure you're not Jewish anymore? Let me see you eat this bacon." And all this other crazy stuff, right? But the big place he does this at is the Council of Trent, right? Which is a several times meeting idea. And as you can see, he was doing this when Calvin was still active and alive. Was he alive still? I don't think he was alive, actually. I think he died in like 64, yeah. All right, so yeah, he was still alive. During the lifespan of John Calvin, the Council of Trent begins to meet. And the Council of Trent has major successes where they discuss all these things that Pope Paul once reformed, right? From 1545 to 1563, they meet multiple times. And it's these huge meetings of cardinals and the Pope discussing the issues raised by these reformers, right? Some major successes, they outlaw the sale of indulgences, right? That's huge. Not necessarily the biblical indulgences. They don't say that you can't do good deeds and also take some time off your purgatory, but they outlaw the sale of indulgences. So make the sale of indulgences illegal. They reject the which stinks. They do this, and I don't they do this, and it drives me nuts. They reject the salvation by faith idea, which is a Lutheran concept, because by being in your faith, you can then also go to heaven. So they still retain the sacraments list, which is a little annoying, personally. Actually, that's not true. It's something that, it's just different. It's not annoying, it's just different. I was just raised Protestant. It's just different. I respect it. I get it. Now, anyway, but they're also going to acknowledge corruption of the clergy, right? They're going to acknowledge that some of these clergy members are having illegitimate kids. They're going to acknowledge the idea that, some of these clergy members need to be brought up on reform. So they're actually trying to work to fix that and use the Inquisition to even hunt down their own clergy that are violating these rules. They're going to begin to bring women in as well to help educate children, right? They're going to help get women to create some of the first Catholic schools, right? No! To actually create, the nuns and the sisters would be brought in to help educate children in the ways of the Catholic Church, right? They're also going to create new orders, right? And the new orders are going to be very important. We're going to talk about those. Put a little star next to those new orders, right? We're going to talk about two of them, okay? Now, they are going to have some failures, though, too. They did not attempt to reconcile with Lutherans, which really stinks. They kind of just said, well, Lutherans will be Lutherans, right? And Lutherans are going to be over there. And if any Catholic country acknowledges or accepts Lutheranism, then they themselves are sinning. So he could have done a little bit better about that. And the Council of Trent could have done a little bit better about that. But he also, just only acknowledged their existence, which is really annoying. Same thing with the Calvinists, too, right? Acknowledge that they're just there, right? And some of these new orders are going to pop up, though. We're going to see new orders of priests, right? Because you've had some priests that have existed since the Middle Ages, right? Franciscans, Benedictine monks, all these other groups of people. But the big goal of these new orders is going to harp on the education of priests and people, right? To spread the faith using education, right? Teach them mathematics and about Christ, all right? So, this is a big deal. And one of the biggest ones that was created was the Ursuline Order of Nuns, right? Which is, of course, what Ursuline Academy is named after. I know some of you are like, ugh, but still, all right, it's very, very important. The Ursuline nuns were an order of nuns founded by Angela Merici, not Medici, but Merici, which concentrated on the education of young women to raise the collective intelligence of a household. Christine de Pizan and Isabella d'Este would be so proud by this. They're basically trying to harp on the idea of educating young women to have smart women. If you have smart women who make smart mothers make smarter children, right? Smarter children make better attributes to the Catholic faith, right? So the Ursuline nuns are going to be a major one, but this is the biggest one. The Society of the Jesuits. Again, what Jesuit high school is named after. Founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola, right? St. Ignatius of Loyola encourages education above all things, right? Helps spread Christianity and humanist thought, actual Renaissance ideas, right? To place it, and the Jesuits take it upon themselves to spread the Catholic faith and education to places like Japan, India, Brazil, North America, the Congo. They spread faith and intelligence all over the place, right? And where did this all come from? Because St. Ignatius of Loyola himself was a former soldier, actually. He was actually a soldier before he actually entered into the priesthood. And while he was a soldier, he had actually been wounded in battle, right? And since he was stuck inside of a cast and on a bed for so long, he was like, you know what? I've got to figure out, I can't exercise my body right now, so what I'll do is I'll exercise my faith, right? And he would read a certain number of Psalms every day. He would read a certain number of, Latin, what do they call, parables every single, not a parable, I don't know. There's a psalm, there's other things. All right, so he would read a bunch of those every day. Verses, all right, so he would read a certain number of verses every day as like his exercise program, right? I'm going to do 30 flexes, and I'm going to read 30 verses, and I'm going to do 30 push-ups, and I'm going to read 30 psalms, right? It's a very bro-y kind of thing. And big thing about it, why they're so important, is your boy Francis himself is a Jesuit, right? So like a Jesuit monk, all right? So the big thing about it is these orders still exist, and they still permeate our society, and they are products of the Counter Reformation. And with our bad boy Francis, I will literally tell you straight up, I love this guy. I think he's awesome. I imagine he drives a white Harley all the time and is just like throwing holy water bombs at people because the man, I actually saw him in Philadelphia. He's a really good guy. Very, very big fan of the Pope. But anyway, so on that note, I'll talk to you guys later. Y'all have a good one.